Who is Sleeping Giants, or what is Sleeping Giants and NewsGuard? Most people are not aware of these things. Talk
Sure.
about what they are, the significance, and how they've intersected with your work.
Yeah, so they're part of this generation of self-appointed censors who are trying to police the internet and try to sanitize it from content that they would argue is either fake news or creating violence or spreading disinformation. But the pattern is more that they're doing it for people that are putting out content that it does not fit the establishment narrative or the Democrat narrative. And as is so often the case throughout the book, as I document, their test cases are Breitbart. And Sleeping Giants was apparently their founders, a guy named Matt Rivets, who's an ad executive, and a woman in tech, I believe, named Nandini Jammy, who were these people who didn't go to Breitbart routinely until Donald Trump won. But when Trump won, and we were associated with Trump's rise, they started to check us out, and they found a few opinion pieces that most of them written tongue in cheek and clearly the voices of specific authors. And they used that to try to paint the entire website, which we produce 100 pieces of original content a day, as some sort of radical extreme thing that must not have advertising. And so they went around with a AstroTurf group of people on Twitter asking advertisers not to advertise on Breitbart. And what happened is that some of them went with it because they probably ideologically do disagree. Some of them went with it, we presume, because they were under some pressure and they don't like being under pressure. And other times we think that it was people stuck with us. So they did this for years, and then they expanded to Tucker Carlson and others. But what ended up happening during this process is the Sleeping Giants reset the way companies thought about their online advertising. And I go through this in detail in the book. I don't want to get too granular because it's there for anyone who wants to read it. But the way online advertising is done is generally it goes to a third-party broker, typically Google or a huge outlet like that, and they match the reader with the content. They have an algorithm that thinks that if you're reading X, then you probably might buy Y product, which is mutually beneficial. So it's mutually beneficial for Breitbart because we then get product placed that our reader might buy, and is beneficial for the company who's selling the product because their product is appearing in front of eyeballs that are likely to buy it. The system worked fine, and no one was unhappy about it for the most part, until Sleeping Giant said, wait a minute, what if you don't want your company to appear on that content regardless of who's the reader? And when people started thinking about that, it started with because Breitbart was supposed to be so evil and horrible and miserable. But then what ended up happening is the advertising businesses started to extrapolate out, and they started to think, well, maybe we don't want to be advertising on content about the coronavirus or about Donald Trump or about war. And all of these topics where it started to seem gratuitous for you to put advertising on these stories. And this totally devastated and decimated the advertising industry. Now, at Breitbart, we're lean and mean. We don't have a huge staff and we have a ton of traffic. So we did fine. We survived the campaign. But what's interesting is the rest of the world, the rest of the news media, sometimes did markedly worse than we did during this time, which is why even though traffic to websites during the Trump years, they were up so high, and yet ad revenue was down. And you can thank the Sleeping Giants. You can thank Matt Rivets and Nandini Jammy. So if you are a person who didn't get a raise or you had your job cut during the advertising downturn of recent years, I would ask those two if this was what they had in mind. And I'm sure it isn't, but it is an unbelievable consequence. I know that was a huge answer on Sleeping Giants. A NewsGuard, very similar. What they do is they give a blanket score on a website. Either you're good guys or bad guys. You're green check or red check. And they set the standards. We don't really know who they are other than that they're associated with establishment media outlets, establishment political parties. And if you're not really forthcoming with them and you do whatever they say, then they brand you red. And it's an absurd thing. Like if you, with the Breitbart, we syndicate the AP. So a Breitbart AP story, for example, will get a red block on it because Breitbart is not trustworthy. But the New York Times syndicates the AP. If they put up the same exact story, they get a green shield indicating that it's safe. It's safe to read this. It's totally bogus. It's funded by Microsoft, and it's just designed to shut out people who buck the status quo.
These stories kind of call to mind the kind of whack-a-mole nature of online activity, would-be censorious behavior. I mean, every day you look on Facebook, what are the most popular pages? Maybe this is tweaked in some way that you have insight on, but it's usually like Dan Bongino,
right?
Breitbart, Ben Shapiro. Like it's just constantly that. You use a phrase, especially in the latter half of the book, of the Silicon Valley masters of the universe. Can they really be masters of the universe when it is so easy to route around what they are doing?
So I think that Facebook is noteworthy because they have allowed for some conservative content to do very well there. The content, though, that works on Facebook is not all of our content. A lot of the content that's most popular with our readers gets fact-checked instantly on Facebook, even if it's true. I mean, the best example of recent, as we're recording this, I know this will air a little later, and I don't recall exactly what Breitbart reported on this, but how many fact checks were there about Wuhan lab theories that were just fact-checked by establishment sanctioned fact checkers? And then, as it turns out, well, now they're rethinking that. And the things that Breitbart puts out that are true so often get fact checked as false or misleading because we didn't supply enough context, whereas blatant falsehoods from CNN, the New York Times, et cetera, thrive. So we're not treated equally on those platforms. We noticed a shift after the 2016 election when it comes to Facebook. Breitbart was the number one biggest outlet, I believe. It was very close with Breitbart, New York Times, and the Huffington Post in terms of influence ahead of 2016. And right at the beginning of, I think it was 2018, Facebook just switched their algorithm. They turned a dial. Our traffic plummeted on Facebook, not to zero, but it went from, we were in the top 5 to down to about 20 in terms of most popular publishers. And then CNN went up during that time. And it is clearly there was a manipulation. We weren't banned per se, but our reach was diminished, which hurts our business. And again, for Breitbart, we can weather some of these storms because of our size. But a lot of our friends and colleagues in upstart conservative media, they just went kaput completely because they had sunk so much in their business model being Facebook shares. So while Breitbart does do very well on Facebook, I do believe we would be doing much better if there weren't a lot of these, a governor put in place by people who are unelected, unaccountable in Silicon Valley, who never explain themselves or what they're doing. It's all very mysterious what they do. But Twitter clearly censors conservative speech and conservative falsehoods more than not even just left of center speech. I mean, how much calls to violence from overseas leaders are allowed to stay on the page, whereas a normative conservative thought can get you thrown off of Twitter. And Google is the clearest example, where in May of last year, Breitbart's traffic on Joe Biden stories went literally to zero. Unless you put the word Breitbart in the Google search, you're not going to ever get a Joe Biden story from Breitbart, even an exclusive story. If I went to Donald Trump during the campaign, got an exclusive quote about Joe Biden, it was not going to show up in Google searches unless you put the word Breitbart in there. Clearly, that's manipulation, and that is a masters of the universe type behavior because they're controlling so much of the information we all consume each day. Whether or not it's a pure blanket boycott or censorship, that varies from outlet to outlet. But clearly, they're doing massive amounts of manipulation. Do you disagree, Matt, with that? That they're doing something?
They're absolutely doing things right and left on a daily basis. And I think the suppression of the Hunter Biden story in particular in October, November of last year, and kicking the New York Post off of Twitter really gratuitously for a week. And I say that as I don't really care overly much about the Hunter Biden story. We can disagree offline about that. But I don't want Twitter to be kicking off politicians and saying to a long established newspaper, you can't write about this. It is inherently ridiculous. The question becomes, and this is where I will now ask you the question, sir.
Sure.
But what is the remedy? You mentioned that these are unelected people. Well, we don't want to elect our social media platforms. The phrase that you used towards the end, and this is strong, coming from a conservative, and it's different than what we would hear from conservatives 30 years ago. I'll read it to you. When conservatives take power next, their top priority should be restraining big tech, holding them accountable for their anti-conservative bias, favoritism toward major corporations, and monopolistic tendencies. Every available avenue to weaken these monopolies and oligopolies should be considered, unquote. Do you think that having the federal government kind of weaponized to check the power of people based on their viewpoints is going to end well for free speech?
I don't know if that's how I would boil it down exactly. What I would look at now is the vast majority of free speech, which is, I know the letter of the law with the First Amendment is talking about the government, but the reality is that conservative speech is not as valuable as liberal speech at this time, according to the people who control it the most. And that is something that we need to deal with. Now, how to deal with it is more of a challenge, and it's something that's up for debate. But clearly, whatever we're doing now is not working. It's leading to clear manipulation on behalf of Democrat politics, which I go through in the book a number of times. And you cite a perfect example, which is the totally true Hunter Biden story, which was branded Russian disinfo and memory hold. So it's for conservatives where we are getting crushed, not by the Democrats. We are getting crushed by people in Silicon Valley who are controlling the First Amendment at this time. And so either we are trusting them with our First Amendment, or there's something that must be done about it. And this is and this is one of the biggest challenges of our time, because if we do nothing, what's going to happen is you're going to see every year more conservatives just getting removed, memory hold from the internet. And so then what are our options? And this is where I think we're going to have to use the states as test kitchens, and we're going to have to see what can survive legal challenges, because not everything will. But there needs to be a lot that's on the table. And I wouldn't limit it to the government doing something like breaking up these companies, because I think they're big enough now and monopolistic enough where that should be a consideration. Antitrust laws kind of seems ineffectual here, so that should be looked at again, whether or not that needs some level of reform. Reforms to Communications Decency Act Section 230 are big, but I don't think that people fully understand how to do that properly. So these are tough calls, but I don't think that just leaving this one up to we're just going to build our own Twitter. I mean, look what happened with Parler. They did build their own Twitter, and Amazon kicked them off. There's just too much infrastructure that would need to be built by conservatives to compete, that we're just going to be totally destroyed by the time that happens.
You write in Masters of Universe parlance here that it is apparent to me that the suppression of conservative-friendly stories and the elevation of hoax narratives that benefit Joe Biden were enough to swing the election on its own. You all say, I believe the Masters of the Universe were the single biggest deciding factor in the 2020 election, unquote. How is that any less conspiratorial, let's say, than what MSNBC talked about for 3 years after 2016?
Sure, and I show it in the data, and I show it with a survey the Media Research Center did, where they laid out the top narratives that were going against Joe Biden, which is Hunter Biden scandals and some of his business dealings, that Kamala Harris was the most radical leftist in the Senate, at least according to one major survey, and that Joe Biden had been credibly accused of a sexual assault when he was in the Senate by a staffer. And this is something that is, remember, we were supposed to believe all women. And then also all of the good news that was coming out of Donald Trump's America. In Donald Trump's America, you were seeing really terrific jobs numbers. Peace was returning to the Middle East for the first time in my lifetime. And the vaccine was on track, which was shocking everyone, me included. And all of that stuff was, and a few others. And the Media Research Center highlighted this in a survey. And they concluded that 17% of people who voted for Joe Biden, had they been aware of all 8 of the things they laid out, which again, I go through in the book, they would not have voted for Biden. It doesn't mean they would have voted for Trump, but it means they wouldn't have voted for Biden. And I think the logic that the people who control our information are the people who are the ones who can decide the most votes and swing the most votes, I don't think that's conspiratorial at all. Conspiratorial at all. How else are people supposed to choose where they vote unless it is based off of what they're reading and what they're talking about with friends and family? I don't know what else would swing the vote that much. Is it TV ads? I don't know what the alternative would be.
Well, so, as someone who went on MSNBC quite a lot in 2016, 17, 18, 19, whenever someone would say the election was rigged, or it was in some way like manipulated, hacked, I would always point out, no one got in between a voter and the voting machine, as far as we know. There might have been individual anomalies here and there, but using that word is tendentious, and as is the notion that $100,000 worth of Facebook ads, as you rightly point out in the book, somehow is going to swing things. It's positing individual consumers as being these manipulatable sheep, a robot sheep that you can press the right button on a social media platform, and it's going to change. I think you quote a guy saying as many as 15 million votes. That's bananas. 15 million votes were not changed by social media, were they? Do you really think that's a possibility?
No, I don't know if 15 million votes were changed from social media. It's impossible to quantify that sort of thing. But I do think that the numbers were so narrow. And I go through in the book exactly how narrow the margins were in these swing states. I mean, it was tens of thousands of votes overall. At most, a couple of 100,000 votes swung the whole election. So it doesn't need to be 15. It doesn't need to be 15 million. It doesn't need to be a fraction of that. It just needs to be enough people in those states, Georgia, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Arizona, just 2 or 3 of those states, and the election has a totally different outcome. And do I believe that had Silicon Valley been fair to Trump and the Republicans and people like Breitbart and treated us the same that CNN has treated, that there would have been tens of thousands of more votes that went at least against Biden? Yeah, absolutely. I believe that would be the case. So so the 15 million number, I cite that as an example of a case that's being made by a scholarly guy who votes Democrat. The guy, Robert Epstein, you're quoting, he does vote Democrat. He voted for Biden. He wants Biden to win. Now, it is a perspective that is not aired at all. And I don't think it's fair to dismiss it as conspiratorial. It is no more conspiratorial than the stuff we were getting on a consistent basis. It's impossible to back up. I get it. It's impossible to back up on a literal level, but it does make you consider the power of social media, which is not being done. We're just accepting social media as a given in our life. And I do think people need to understand, and hopefully the book makes this case, that taking seriously the power they have over our politics is so immense, it's incalculable.